It's dark in the forest where the stubborn Sadu met Haim for the first time. She came through a portal. She asked him to forget about their strange encounter and they became friends afterwards. 10 years later, Haim wakes the sleepyhead Sadu up for breakfast. They have been good friends for the past 10 years and are now neighbors. She has been living with her old grandpa since then. They leave for school even though Sadu is a dullard and won't understand anything. On their way to school, Sadu asks Haim about the 2 rings tied around her neck in the form of a necklace. Haim explains that one of the rings is for her husband and dumb Sadu can't have it. Sadu recollects when they were younger when Haim asked Sadu to marry her and then give him the ring. Back in school, the students talk about the summer break starting the next day even though the dumbasses have nothing good to do. Sadu receives a text message from Haim that they should go to the summer festival after school. Later that night, Sadu and Haim arrive at the festival. They get to a shooting shop where Sadu channels his inner John Wick and wins Haim a teddy bear. During the fireworks show, Haim breaks it to Sadu that she's leaving the next day. She tells him she is going back to her grandpa's homeland. This news breaks his heart into a gazillion pieces. They get home shortly after, and Sadu rues the news about Haim's departure like a man going through a divorce. He sums up courage and follows Haim to where she's going. He comes across her leaving through a portal. She tells him she is going to her wedding. The bastard using 0 brain cells jumps in with her too. The idiot arrives at the wedding ceremony of Haim and a prince which shocks Haim. Then suddenly, a party pooper monster who is after Haim shows up. The grandpa jumps in to fight the monster but is swatted away like a fly. He asks Haim to give the ring of light to Sadu, but she decides to kiss Sadu instead, which activates the ring of light. The prince accepts this and gives Sadu a sword to attack the monster. Surprisingly, even to useless Sadu himself, he manages to strike down the monster with the sword, and he then passes out. The next morning, Haim wakes Sadu up and narrates what happened the day before. She explains she gave him the ring instead because he's a familiar face instead of the prince. Later that day, some busybody officials criticize the actions of the princess, but the prince assures them that everything is still good. After a while, the lowlife is introduced to the people as their ring king. After a while, Sadu and Haim meet up, and Haim apologizes for dragging him into the mess, but the foolish Sadu says it's okay. He also promises to stay and protect her. They are interrupted by a group of monsters banging on the castle door. Sadu suits up and tries to fight them. Sadu kills 3 of those demons and he is surprised his weak ass has not passed yet. The grandpa, Sage Alabaster, explains that when Haim kisses him, it grants him power. Suddenly, an abyss knight appears and Sadu foolishly rushes to attack him but gets his ass handed to him. The sage asks them to run away because the knight is too powerful. They run away but they later get cornered by the knight. The prince then jumps in like Batman and saves them. He escorts them outside where they meet up with Haim. Shortly after, the prince drives them away from the kingdom and introduces himself to Sadu as Mars, the second prince of the Jasara's empire. The sage informs Sadu that the Abyss King is after the rings and the Ring King himself. He continues by explaining that Sadu is still a weak ass and can't fight the Abyss King. Sadu will have to marry 4 other princesses so he can obtain the rings from them, which is the responsibility of the Ring King. Haim is saddened by this. Later that night, they all lodge in an inn to spend the night. Sadu and Haim are asked to share the same room. The sage explains the history of the Ring King, and how he forged magical rings to fight evil, so a green lantern. The 5 rings were the rings of light, fire, water, wind, and earth. Afterward, the 5 princesses married the Ring King and then passed the rings down through generations within their 5 nations. Sadly, the Abyss King is now regaining power and the Ring King has to fight him. Afterwards, in their room, Haim discovers bruises on Sadu's body where his noob ass was beaten to a pulp. Haim feels this is her fault and tearfully runs away. Sadu chases after her where he meets Mars on the way. Mars's useless ass expresses joy at not being the Ring King. He then tells Sadu where Haim ran. Moments later, Sadu catches up with Haim and she feels dejected. Sadu, like a fool, confesses his love to her, which surprises her. He then reassures her that he feels okay to be there. Haim feels relieved and appreciates his sentiments towards her. But her jealous ass points out the fact that he is the Ring King and will have to marry other princesses. She then promises to be a real wife to him. Following that, they head back to their room where they feel awkward. Spineless Sadu advises they take things slow, and they both share a kiss. The next morning, Mars hands them some outfits that will help them blend easily. They all then head to the hidden village of the elves, Ronka. They get to Ronka but are disturbed by a terrible wind wall guarding the village from intruders. Then suddenly, a very large bear shows up and chases them around like they are the last donuts in the forest. Entrapped, they are saved by two elves who show them a secret and safe path to the village. Getting to the palace, they meet the elf princess who appears like she has one or two screws loose in her head, and then she runs away. The gang is shocked due to the elf princess's behavior. Shortly after, the elder prince, Jade Ronka, shows up. He introduces himself and takes Sadhu to prison. Right after where Sadhu's guilty ass is thrown in prison, Jade tells Sadhu that his sister, Princess Nephritis, is generally timid and has never left the palace. He adds that it is way too early for her to get married even though her old ass is 54 years old. He tells Sadhu that he'll be in prison for 80 years until Nephritis is mature enough. The bastard will probably die of old age. A moment later, Jade reiterates to one of the guards that he doesn't care about the Abyss King, adding that they are protected within their Tempest wall. 3 days pass by and the lockup legend is still in his cell. He is rescued by one of the elder elves. She leads him out through an underground passage where they end up at the Wind Temple, the location of the Wind Ring. Almost immediately, Nephritis shows up and the other two skedaddle like rats and hide. The princess makes some prayers to the statues of her parents in the temple. Sadhu, the decibel demon, makes a noise that gets the attention of Nephritis. Sadhu with 0 brain cells tries to distract her by making bird noises. Sadhu reveals himself, which makes Nephritis faint. They then take her away. The news of the princess's disappearance gets to Jade, who cries around like a bitch. Shortly after her abduction, the elder leaves Sadhu with Nephritis, who is still sleeping. After a short while, she wakes up and the first thing she sees is Sadhu's ugly head, which makes her vomit all over. Subsequently, the elf elder reveals to the prince that Sadhu and the princess have eloped together, which drives him bananas. He then commands them to have her room searched. Back to Sadhu and Nephritis, Sadhu has washed the clothes the princess vomited on, which she appreciates. She explains that she has not left the village, which makes anybody outside, including Sadhu, scary. Sadhu tells her about the world his pathetic ass came from. She narrates how she's too much of a scaredy cat to go outside. She relies only on stories the elder elves tell her and the books she reads, but the real her is stuck there and she can't leave. She then expresses interest in going to his world and touching some grass. Suddenly, Jade shows up outside and calls them out. Nephritis tries to defend Sadhu, but Jade forcefully calls her in. Jade tries to punish them further, but he is stopped by the elder, who claims responsibility. She manages to reach an agreement with Jade, while he takes poor Nephritis away. Later that day, the elf introduces herself to the gang as Period, the oldest elf in the village. She then narrates how Nephritis became an airhead. Nephritis' mom's elder sister cursed the village because the people were very against her relationship with a human outsider. Nephritis' parents later inherit the ring and had Nephritis promise to them to never venture outside the Wall of Wind. Sage Alabaster suggests they all leave the elf village because there is no more time to waste. He suggests they obtain the most rings in the least amount of time. Looking at them down below, the Captain Cocky Prince is delighted they are leaving. Suddenly, a guard announces to him that abyss monsters have made it past the wall, and there are more lurking outside. On their way out, the gang sees this and turns back to fight the monsters. Haim kisses Sadhu to give the noob strength. Afterward, the monsters lay waste to the elf villagers. Back in the castle, the wimp princess cowers and says there's nothing to do, and also she's trying to fulfill her promises to her parents. Thereafter, the Abyss Knight shows up at the Wind Temple where the Wind Ring is located. Jade tries to stop it, but the knight mops the floor with him. The gang shows up to save his chicken ass. Sadhu and Mars rush together to attack the knight like headless goats, but they have their asses handed to them. Sadhu rushes again but gets beaten to a pulp. Haim realizes that she alone is not good enough to grant Sadhu strength, so she rushes to meet Nephritis. Period joins a while later and tells Sadhu about Haim's plan. A while later, Sadhu meets Nephritis, whom she begs to not be a weakling, and joins them in the fight by granting Sadhu strength. She reassures her that Sadhu is fighting for everyone, including her sorry ass. After shedding tears like a crocodile, Nephritis agrees to join. Right after, they join the gang in the Wind Temple and break the statues of her parents, freeing the rings and also breaking the wind barrier. Nephritis picks up the ring and gives one to Sadhu, and also kisses him, granting him extra strength but not extra sense. This action makes their rings glow so bright, brighter than your future, ultimately killing the monsters and incapacitating the knight. Sadhu then finishes off the knight and the lazy ass passes out. Not long after, Sadhu's lazy ass wakes up and he's praised by the rest of the gang. It is later revealed that the knight that attacked them was Nephritis' mom's elder sister Princess Smaragdi, who had run away because the people didn't accept her lover. She was under control by a black ring of wind deceitfully given to her by the Abyss King. Sadhu tries to stand up but the numbskull is too weak. Period explains to him that the excess powers of the rings he consumed made him very weak. Later that night, Sage Alabaster reveals to Princess Smaragdi that he has known about her former lover for a long time. He then hands her a watch she had given to her lover a long time ago. He tells her that the lover lives a peaceful life in a land far from there. The next morning, Nephritis announces her decision to leave and join Sadhu with her brother, which the Duke of Arrogance grants. She later meets up with the gang and they leave. Sage Alabaster recommends the gang to the Land of Water, the nation of the dragon folk. Haim gets jealous about the extra attention Sadhu has been given Nephritis. Shortly after where they are, they come across a moving town which Alabaster reveals is the Land of Fire, Nidakita, the nation of wandering knights and cat people. The gang climbs up to the city through a ladder thrown at them. As expected, spineless Nephritis has trouble climbing up the ladder. Mrs. Know-It-All Nephritis explains to the gang that many strong cat people make up Nidakita Knights. Therefore, many merchants sought to travel with them for their protection. Shortly after, Sadhu loses both Haim and Nephritis and is worried. Jellyfish Nephritis freaks out that they have separated from the rest of the gang, but Haim calms her down. They meet some cat people who ask them to go to the arena where they can find the people they are looking for. Sadhu, shaking like a palm tree in a storm, fears about the girls. Alabaster calms him down and tells them they will find them. Later, two cat ladies come to meet them and express their love for Mars, which angers ugly Sadhu. The ladies then redirect them to the arena where the warriors who want to court the princess go to. They see a pathetic loser who's been beaten up and thrown outside the arena, and then they happily see the rest of the gang coming towards them. The cat ladies then invite them inside the arena. Moments later, they enter the arena and find the fire princess beating the daylights out of her suitors. She challenges Sadhu next and also notes him being the ring king. She rushes Sadhu and gives him a good thrashing. The princess says she expects better and Sadhu is just pathetic. He then asks them to come another day to challenge her. Later that day, Mars engages Sadhu in some sword sparring lessons, but the idiot doesn't stand a chance. Afterward, they are served food by one of the cat men. He reveals to the gang how so many male suitors have come to challenge the princess, but they have their asses handed to them. He also encourages Sadhu to use magic during his duel with the princess, adding that it is fair. Sadhu feels like a loser and how opus the princess is. Haim meets him and tells him it's alright to feel weak. She adds that as long as his weak ass uses the ring's power well, that's enough. Nephritis sees them in a compromising situation and gets jealous. Nephritis creeps on Sadhu on his bed like a rat. She encourages him to use the power of the ring in his coming duel against Granart. She explains further the job of the Ring King is to collect all the rings and no one will question the means his fraudulent ass used to achieve that. Sadhu thanks her for her support. Sadhu and Mars continue their sword training and Mars tells Sadhu that he has improved a bit. This improves his odds of winning the duel from 0 in a million to 1 in a million. Mars also tells him to just use his magic and it'll work out. Haim watches and overhears some cat ladies talking about how Granart fell for Hatu, which makes her go bananas. The next day, the brat Sadoi faces off against Granart and Haim feels worried. A loser warrior that Granart had previously beaten comes across the dark ring of the Abyss King, which he wears and becomes possessed into an Abyss Knight. He then runs to the arena stage and disrupts the duel. The knight summons some abyss monsters, which makes the audience turn into a panic parade. The cat ladies' warriors join in to fight the monsters. Granart instructs them to contain the monsters and not let any escape. Granart strikes the knight with her sword but it melts it. The overconfident brat Sadhu rushes to attack the knight but he gets sent to Pluto. Granart suggests they work together to defeat the knight. Sadhu uses the rings to disorient the knight while Granart knocks it down. Sadhu then deals the finishing blow which kicks the evil ring out. Afterward, Granart praises Sadhu that even though he might be useless, he still has potential as the Ring King. She adds that she doesn't mind being his wife, which upsets Haim. But to everybody's shock, Sadhu's pompous ass rejects this and still wishes to engage in the duel with her. Shortly after, the duel starts and Granart lands Sadhu on his ass to no one's surprise. Granart advises him to use the power of the rings but the dumbass refuses. Then suddenly, one of the rings speaks to him and tells him it'll help him and read Granart's next attack. Granart charges to attack him again. and the voice tells Sadu where she is going to attack from, which helps Sadu encountering her and kicking her butt to the curb, which declares him as the winner. Granart is shocked at this and proceeds to kiss Sadu, sharing her ring with him. She says she has truly acknowledged his useless being. Sadu wakes the next day and Granart invites them all to a banquet. Granart excitedly announces to her people that they are siding with the Ring King once again. The gang arrives at the Land of Water. Sadu asks for Mars, but he's informed he had gone ahead earlier than then, which makes Sadu suspicious. Suddenly, a strange girl runs up to the brat Sadu and kisses him, giving him her ring. She reveals herself to be Princess Sapphire Masa, the Maiden of the Ring of Water. Alabaster appreciates her for being very cooperative. Masa informs Sadu that since he's now her husband, he's then the king of the Land of Water, which shocks Sadu because he's useless. Sapphire tries to lead them away, but a big brute soldier who wasn't shown love at home stops her and asks them to return to the palace. During their journey to the palace, Sapphire tells the gang how the Jasara's Empire troops fill the city and none of Masa's troops are present. Sapphire explains how the empire continues to grow larger by forging ties with many other nations. It's later revealed that the big brute soldier is Mars's elder brother. A short moment later, the gang arrives at the palace where they are warmly greeted by an abyss monster. Like prime Jon Snow, Sadu jumps in with his sword and with the help of the rings he's able to finish off the monster. Subsequently, they enter the palace and Sapphire introduces the gang to her father, the king. The Looney Tunes king starts behaving bonkers and is escorted away by Vixen, the palace oracle. Sapphire narrates how her father used to be a wise king until the over-reliance on Vixen. Later, Sapphire's twin sister, Sapphira, shows and she's upset by Sapphire's decision to give away the ring without her permission. Sapphira criticizes how ugly Sadu is. Mars then calls on Sapphira, but she ignores his clown ass and runs away. Sapphire then narrates the love history between Mars and Sapphira. Mars was a representative of the Jasara's empire who was sent to make diplomacy with the Land of Water. Then Mars and Sapphira fell in love, but Mars left and his disappointing ass never showed up again. He later informed her that he'd be the Ring King and by there they could be together again. But the Mars was a scaredy cat and never became the Ring King, thereby abandoning his vow to Sapphira. Later that night, Vixen plans to assassinate Sadu and steal the rings from him. The assassins show up at the rooftop, but Granart quickly beats them to crap, but they escape through a smoke bomb. The next morning, Sadu is told about the assignation attempt. An assassin also shoots an arrow at them, but it's secretly foiled by Alabaster. The next day, during a fun day out, Sapphire warns Sadu to still be wary of Vixen or else his sorry ass will regret it. Later that night, Mars's elder brother scornfully applauds him for giving the Empire info about the Ring King. Afterwards, Mars comes across Vixen, who deceitfully tasks him to kill the Ring King. Vixen manipulates Mars and asks him if he wants to betray the Empire again and also disappoints Sapphira. She then gives him an ancient magical sword which she claims will be able to fight Sadu's magical rings. Mars then foolishly collects it. The next morning, Mars recollects how his father called him a failure because he couldn't capture any region for the Empire. He then asked him to prove he was not too useless. He finds Sapphira along the road, who then runs away from him. This fuels his negative emotions and gives the sword better control over him. Afterwards, Mars's brother plans how they will battle the monsters that will soon show up outside, while he instructs the gang to stay inside the palace. Subsequently, they go outside and the princesses shamelessly fight over who gets to kiss Sadu. Then suddenly, a monster as ugly as a toad in a tuxedo shows up, similar to the monster that had shown up earlier. As Sadu plans how to fight it, useless Mard rushes and tries to strike Sadu, but he dodges it like a low-budget Spider-Man. Alabaster tells Sadu to focus on Mars while he fights the monster. Mars tells Sadu of his plans to kill him and then collect the rings. They engage in a brief fight and Mars whoops Sadu's ass, although he's holding back. Alabaster warns Sadu that Mars is not in his right mind and is probably under control. He tries to attack with one of the rings, but Mars's magical sword parries it away. One of the rings tells Sadu about the sword and its abilities. The ring also suggests he has the full power of the rings to obliterate Mars, but Goody Two-Shoes Sadu rejects. Sadu then notices although Mars is much better than him, Sadu is uninjured. He then assumes that Mars is still in there somewhere. He then allows Mars to strike him to test his resolve, but Mars does hit him but does finish it off. The bozo then realizes his error and asks Sadu for forgiveness, which he grants. Sadu then breaks off the power of the magical sword. Subsequently, Alabaster can't hold the monster anymore, which then breaks off to hold Saphira as hostage. Then the evil weasel Vixen shows up and takes control of the monster, which doesn't surprise Alabaster. She asks Sadhu for the rings in exchange for the captured Saphira. Feeling like a useless boss, Mars asks Saphira to marry his useless ass. This distracts Vixen, which gives Sadhu the chance to save Saphira. This infuriates Vixen, who transforms into her true ugly form. Saphir kisses Sadhu, who then transforms into a giant water creature, who then kills the monster. Vixen sees her situation and she cowardly disappears. Not long after, the king, now back to his normal senses, thanks the gang for their efforts in protecting the town. He then permits Mars to marry Saphira. Vixen meets with the Empire Lord, who reveals he knows of her plan and her actions on the Water's Land King. This shocks Vixen, who is then killed by the Empire Lord. Sadhu's wives all argue about who gets to be with the simpleton Sadhu, but Sadhu insists that Haim will always be his number one. The other girls, with no iota of shame, say they don't mind and are as long as they are included. This all later turns out to be a dream in Sadhu's perverted mind. The morning after, he asks Haim if they should go out and spend the rest of the day together, much to the displeasure of Nephritis. But Granart appeases Nephritis that it's okay and they should let them enjoy their day. Promptly after, Sadhu's broke-ass begs Alabaster for money he can spend during the day. Later that day during their date, Granart, Nephritis, and Saphir follow and spy on them like Mission Impossible characters. During their walk around the city, the people of the city gather around the Ring King. They praise him and ask for his autograph. Even though it doesn't feel like a date because of the crowd, Haim is happy because he gets to see Sadhu in his usual dumb self. Subsequently, Sadhu and Haim end up at a love pond, which embarrasses them. Sadhu tries to kiss her, but he doesn't grow a pair and then backs out. Haim asks if he was embarrassed to start it. Granart and the rest of the rascals are fed up and they head home. But Haim catches a glimpse of them as they walk behind her. By evening, Sadhu explains to Haim how their worlds are not that different. He points to Mars and the rest of the princesses trying to live a normal life. He also boastfully talks about his exploits so far and how most people will consider him a hero, a pathetic one though. They make their way home. Haim points out to Sadhu that even though he picked her as his number one, he still has a responsibility towards the remaining princesses and shouldn't neglect their feelings. He then reassures her of his feelings for her and kisses her. The rest of the gang persuades the spineless Saphir to leave the kingdom and follow them in their quest. Saphira then encourages her to go, which she eventually leaves. The gang continues their journey to find the Earth Kingdom. Alabaster tells them about the history of the dwarves. Saphir narrates how the short dwarves hate other races, yet they followed the Ring King and fought against the Abyss King. After the war, they isolated themselves and eventually died out. Eventually, they arrive at the Great Mountain, Kayagamika, where the land of Earth, Idanakan, lies within. The gang has been walking around the mountains for 3 days and lazy bones Sadhu is already frustrated. Alabaster shows the gang ruins of corpses of monsters that were killed during the war. Alabaster says they call it a day and look for where to rest. Later that night, Sadhu asks Alabaster, the great sage, if there is any point in gathering the rings. He adds that although people call him Ring King, it doesn't feel like anyone is expecting his good-for-nothing ass to defeat the Abyss King. Alabaster explains that due to the vastness of the world, different people have different ideas, and not everybody will count on the same hope. Sadhu figures out there's less faith in the rings than he thought, maybe because they are being worn by an idiot. Alabaster then describes the immeasurable power of the Abyss King and how hard he'll almost be impossible to defeat. Later that morning, the gang arrives at the land of Earth. They come across different ruins of the fallen kingdom and notice the dwarves couldn't rebuild after the war. Shortly after, they come across a giant door which they enter. They discover the room to be the former throne of the palace. Sadhu comes across a robot-like object. Alabaster explains that it's a sorcerer's unit, a puppet that functions through magic. He explains further how the dwarves are involved in magical mechanisms. Then suddenly, the sorcerer's unit wakes up and starts moving like something out of The Walking Dead. It attacks Sadhu, but he manages to block and then counter. It wakes up again and the gang notices it's wearing a dark ring from the Abyss King. It questions why it was only the dwarves that perished and not other kingdoms. Skill issue, I guess. It then pulls up a giant obstacle, stranding Sadhu from the rest of the gang. The unit warns Sadhu to not interfere in the war because he's an outsider, but the stubborn goat refuses. He then manages to break the obstacle, allowing the others to join him. Haim kisses him, which grants him strength. Then he finishes off the unit like it's a piece of trash. The black ring from the unit vanishes, likewise the other black rings with them. They realize the Abyss King's resurrection has started. Immediately after, 2 large abyss monsters teleport to them. Realizing they are wimps, they run away. They run outside and find more monsters waiting for them. They then grow some balls and fight the monsters. Realizing they are overwhelmed, the weaklings flee again. They run away to a high location and find a huge portal where the Abyss monsters are trooping in. They realize the Abyss King has been fully resurrected. Alabaster tells Sadu he won't be able to fight the Abyss King if he doesn't have all 5 rings. Alabaster realizes the worst has come. He opens a portal and sends the rest of the gang back to Earth, except Mars, who chooses to stay and defend. Back on Earth, the princesses go to a mall where they get some new clothes. Haim is particularly excited about picking their outfits. Shortly after, during lunch, the princesses discuss their kingdoms back in their world and how safe they are. Sapphire keeps eating cake like her stomach is a tank. Sadu realizes he's too broke for their lunch, but Haim tells him not to worry. Later that night, back in their room, Haim explains to Sadu how her grandpa left a letter for her. In the message, he tells her he's left some money and a house for her. He also tells her he wants her to forget about Arnulus and live a normal life. This makes Haim teary. Several days pass after that, and the princesses are getting adjusted to this world's way of life. One night, Haim secretly follows Sadu to the forest where he regrets not being back in Arnulus. He tells her he's coming there every night like a jobless fellow. Haim tells him to find happiness with her in this world and he should forget about the other world. Sadu shrugs her, and then suddenly a light shines bright beside them, revealing to be Amber Idanakan, the protector of the Ring of Earth. She narrates how she was created by the dwarves to protect and pass on the ring, a replica of the dwarf princess. She continues by saying she was transported to this world by the ring and she'd been waiting for centuries. She attempts to bond with Sadu, but Haim's jealous ass stops it. Haim says Sadu doesn't want to go back. Amber agrees and tells him he can meet her anytime he's ready. Later that night, the goofballs eat dinner, and they share all their experiences so far. Haim, the deception specialist, lies and denies their encounter with Amber that night. Shortly after, they both get to their room and Sadu questions if it's wise to hide Amber from the rest of them. But unknown to them, Granart hears the conversation. Later that night, Sadu meets Amber in the woods where they first met. She reveals to him that she has the power to take them back to Arnulus. The next day at school, Sadu summons Amber. Amber assures him that if has all 5 rings, his weak ass will be able to defeat the Abyss King. Sadu asks for her ring, which she willingly gives to the dimwit. Later that night, Sadu gets home and finds Haim's eyes running like a tap with tears. She mourns her grandpa. She then notices Sadu now has the complete 5 rings. He tells her he's accepted the ring and he's going to Arnulus to Haim's displeasure. Sadu reassures her that they'll still be together. Then suddenly, like a thief in the night, Amber appears with the teleportation spell and asks them all to return to Arnulus. The rest of the princesses arrive and they all leave. The gang is transported back to Idanakan. They come across a large number of dead monsters and dead Imperial soldiers, which suggests that a great battle had happened there. Granart points to some Imperial soldiers engaged in combat. Sadu's rings glow and then suddenly the Abyss King appears. Sadu reassures the princesses that he is going to defeat the Abyss King and he embraces them all. Like Prime Aragon, he jumps in and rushes to attack the Abyss King. He uses the power of his rings to first deal with the monsters by turning them into toast. He then focuses on the Abyss King, who is emitting aura. He strikes the Abyss King, but he parries. Then all 5 rings bind together and become one. Sadu now flows with power and the knucklehead thinks he's all that. He manages to land a very ferocious attack on the Abyss King. This move decimates all the remaining monsters and leaves them eating dust. Sadu thinks he's managed to defeat the Abyss King, but he has other ideas. Now weak from the excess power he used, Sadu falls to the ground. The Abyss King then seizes control over his body like a pathetic puppet and tries to send him to the abyss. The princesses see this and rescue Sadu from the Abyss King's grip. The Abyss King sees the princesses and he shamelessly summons more monsters to fight them. Granart and Amber try to fight them, but they are outnumbered. Sadu tries to use the ring power one last time, but his chicken ass passes out. Long after, Sadu wakes up and finds himself on a giant bird flown by Alabaster, which is also carrying the princesses. He explains to Sadu how he managed to create an opening and save the gang against the Abyss King. He also tells him Mars is safe. He explains that their boneheads were saved by Smaragdi, Nephritis Ant, who is now fond of Alabaster. Alabaster discloses to Sadu that the monsters have withdrawn and he believes the Abyss King has suffered a serious wound too. He encourages Sadu that he's effective against the Abyss King and not useless like he'd thought. They finally get to Haim's kingdom. Alabaster tells Satu and the princesses that the dark rings the Abyss King wore during the fight were strange and unknown. He adds that though, certainly, the Ring King sealed away the Abyss King, they don't know how much power was required to do so. He then suggests they have to draw more power from Satu's ring, which means Satu needs to strengthen his bonds with the ring princesses. Alabaster tells the princesses they will have to undergo wife training and make themselves useful. The next day, Haim brings Satu to the grave of their mother and she lays flowers on them. She tells Satu that her parents are dead, but her little sister is still alive somewhere. Shortly after, Alabaster reveals to Haim that he won't be her magical teacher, but instead another person, Haim's little sister.